Chapter 11 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 11. Our Dear Brother. A touch on the lawyer's wrinkled hand as he stands in the dark room irresolute makes him start and say, "What's that?"
"It's me,"
returns the old man of the house, whose breath is in his ear.
"Can't you wake him?"
"No."
"What have you done with your candle?"
"It's gone out. Here it is." Krook takes it, goes to the fire, stoops over the red embers, and tries to get a light. The dying ashes have no light to spare, and his endeavours are vain. Muttering, after an ineffectual call to his lodger, that he will go downstairs and bring a lighted candle from the shop, the old man departs. Mr. Tulkinghorn, for some new reason that he has, does not await his return in the room, but on the stairs outside. The welcome light soon shines upon the wall, as Krook comes slowly up with his green-eyed cat following at his heels. "Does the man generally sleep like this?" inquired the lawyer in a low voice.
I don't know,"
says Krook, shaking his head and lifting his eyebrows.
"I know next to nothing of his habits, except that he keeps himself very close."
Thus whispering, they both go in together. As the light goes in, the great eyes in the shutters, darkening, seem to close. Not so the eyes upon the bed. "God save us!" exclaims Mr. Tulkinghorn. "He is dead." Krook drops the heavy hand he has taken up so suddenly that the arm swings over the bedside. They look at one another for a moment.
"Send for some doctor. Call for Miss Flite up the stairs, sir. He is poisoned by the bed. Call out for Flite, will you?"
says Krook, with his lean hand spread out above the body like a vampire's wings. Mr. Tulkinghorn hurries to the landing and calls, "Miss Flite! Flite! Make haste here, whoever you are. Flite!" Krook follows him with his eyes, and while he is calling, finds opportunity to steal to the old portmanteau and steal back again. "Run, Flite, run! The nearest doctor, run!" So Mr. Krook addresses a crazy little woman who is his female lodger, who appears and vanishes in a breath, who soon returns, accompanied by a testy medical man brought from his dinner with a broad, snuffy upper lip and a broad Scotch tongue. "Aye, bless your hearts'ree," says the medical man, looking up at them after a moment's examination. "He's just as dead as fairy." Mr. Tulkinghorn, standing by the old portmanteau, inquires if he has been dead any time. "Any time, sir?" says the medical gentleman. "It's probable he will have been dead about 3 hours." "About that time, I should say," observes a dark young man on the other side of the bed. "Are ye in the medical profession yourself, sir?" inquires the first. The dark young man says yes. "Then I'll just tak my departure," replies the other, "for I'm nae good here." With which remark he finishes his brief attendance and returns to finish his dinner. The dark young surgeon passes the candle across and across the face and carefully examines the law-writer, who has established his pretensions to his name by becoming indeed no one. "I knew this person by sight very well," says he. "He has purchased opium of me for the last year and a half. Was anybody present related to him?" glancing round upon the 3 bystanders.
"I was his landlord,"
grimly answers Krook, taking the candle from the surgeon's outstretched hand.
"He told me once I was the nearest relation he had."
"He has died," says the surgeon, "of an overdose of opium, there is no doubt. The room is strongly flavoured with it. There is enough here now," taking an old teapot from Mr. Krook, "to kill a dozen people."
"Do you think he did it on purpose?"
asks Krook. "Took the overdose?"
"Yes."
Krook almost smacks his lips with the unction of a horrible interest. "I can't say. I should think it unlikely, as he has been in the habit of taking so much. But nobody can tell. He was very poor, I suppose?"
"I suppose he was. His room don't look rich,"
says Krook, who might have changed eyes with his cat as he casts his sharp glance around.
"But I have never been in it since he had it, and he was too close to name his circumstances to me."
"Did he owe you any rent?"
6 weeks.
"He will never pay it," says the young man, resuming his examination. "It is beyond a doubt that he is indeed as dead as Pharaoh, and to judge from his appearance and condition, I should think it a happy release. Yet he must have been a good figure when a youth, and I dare say good-looking." He says this not unfeelingly, while sitting on the bedstead's edge with his face towards that other face and his hand upon the region of the heart. I recollect once thinking there was something in his manner, uncouth as it was, that denoted a fall in life. Was that so? He continues, looking round. Krook replies,
"You might as well ask me to describe the ladies whose heads of hair I've got in sacks downstairs, than that he was my lodger for a year and a half and lived, or didn't live, by law writing. I know no more of him."
During this dialogue, Mr. Tulkinghorn has stood aloof by the old portmanteau, with his hands behind him, equally removed, to all appearance, from all three kinds of interest exhibited near the bed. From the young surgeon's professional interest in death, noticeable as being quite apart from his remarks on the deceased as an individual, from the old man's unction, and the little crazy woman's awe. His imperturbable face has been as inexpressive as his rusty clothes. One could not even say he has been thinking all this while. He has shown neither patience nor impatience, nor attention nor abstraction. He has shown nothing but his shell. As easily might the tone of a delicate musical instrument be inferred from its case as the tone of Mr. Tulkinghorn from his case. He now interposes, addressing the young surgeon in his unmoved professional way. "I looked in here," he observes, "just before you, with the intention of giving this deceased man, whom I never saw alive, some employment at his trade of copying. I had heard of him from my stationer, Snagsby, of Cook's Court. Since no one here knows anything about him, it might be as well to send for Snagsby. Ah!" to the little crazy woman who has often seen him in court and whom he has often seen, and who proposes in frightened dumb show to go for the law-stationer. "Suppose you do." While she is gone, the surgeon abandons his hopeless investigation and covers its subject with the patchwork counterpane. Mr. Krook and he interchange a word or two. Mr. Tulkinghorn says nothing, but stands, ever, near the old portmanteau. Mr. Snagsby arrives hastily in his grey coat and his black sleeves.
Dear me, he says. "It has come to this, has it? Bless my soul!"
"Can you give the person at the house any information about this unfortunate creature, Snagsby?" inquires Mr. Tulkinghorn. "He was in arrears with his rent, it seems, and he must be buried, you know."
"Well, sir,"
says Mr. Snagsby, coughing his apologetic cough behind his hand,
"I really don't know what advice I could offer, except sending for the beadle."
"I don't speak of advice," returns Mr. Tulkinghorn. "I could advise—"
"No one better, sir, I'm sure," says Mr. Snagsby with his deferential cough.
"I speak of affording some clue to his connections, or to where he came from, or to anything concerning him."
"I assure you, sir,"
says Mr. Snagsby, after prefacing his reply with his cough of general propitiation,
"that I no more know where he came from than I know—"
"Where he has gone to, perhaps?" suggests the surgeon to help him out. A pause. Mr. Tulkinghorn looking at the law-stationer. Mr. Krook, with his mouth open, looking for somebody to speak next.
"As to his connections, sir," says Mr. Snagsby, If a person was to say to me, 'Snagsby, here's £20,000 down, ready for you in the Bank of England, if you'll only name one of 'em,' I couldn't do it, sir. About a year and a half ago, to the best of my belief, at the time when he first came to lodge at the present rag and bottle shop." "That was the time," says Krook with a nod. "About a year and a half ago," says Mr. Snagsby, strengthened, "he came into our place one morning after breakfast, and finding my little woman, which I name Mrs. Snagsby when I use that appellation, in our shop, produced a specimen of his handwriting and gave her to understand that he was in want of copying work to do and was, not to put too fine a point upon it," a favourite apology for plain speaking with Mr. Snagsby, which he always offers with a sort of argumentative frankness, "hard up, and my little woman is not in general partial to strangers, particular, not to put too fine a point upon it, when they want anything. But she was rather took by something about this person, whether by his being unshaved, or by his hair being in want of attention, or by what other ladies' reasons, I leave you to judge, and she accepted of the specimen and likewise of the address. My little woman hasn't a good ear for names," proceeds Mr. Snagsby, after consulting his cough of consideration behind his hand, "and she considered Nemo equally the same as Nimrod, in consequence of which she got into the habit of saying to me at meals, 'Mr. Snagsby, you haven't found Nimrod any work yet,' or 'Mr. Snagsby, why didn't you give that 8 and 30 Chancery folio in Jarndyce to Nimrod?' or such like. And that is the way he gradually fell into job work at our place. And that is the most I know of him, except that he was a quick hand, and a hand not sparing of night work, and that if you gave him out, say 45 folio on the Wednesday night, you would have it brought in on the Thursday morning. All of which," Mr. Snagsby concludes by politely motioning with his hat towards the bed, as much as to add, "I have no doubt my honourable friend would confirm if he were in a condition to do it." "Hadn't you better see," says Mr. Tulkinghorn to Krook, "whether he had any papers that may enlighten you? There will be an inquest, and you'll be asked the question. You can read?" "No, I can't," returns the old man with a sudden grin. "Snagsby," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, "look over the room for him. You will get into some trouble or difficulty otherwise. Being here, I'll wait if you make haste, and then I can testify in his behalf, if it should ever be necessary, that all was fair and right. If you'll hold a candle for Mr. Snagsby, my friend, you'll soon see whether there is anything to help you." "In the first place, here's an old portmanteau, sir," says Snagsby. Ah, to be sure, so there is. Mr. Tulkinghorn does not appear to have seen it before, though he is standing so close to it, and though there is very little else, heaven knows. The marine store merchant holds the light, and the law stationer conducts the search. The surgeon leans against the corner of the chimney-piece. Miss Flite peeps and trembles just within the door. The apt old scholar of the old school, with his dull black breeches tied with ribbons at the knees, his large black waistcoat, his long-sleeved black coat, and his wisp of limp white neckerchief tied in the bow the peerage knows so well, stands in exactly the same place and attitude. There are some worthless articles of clothing in the old portmanteau. There is a bundle of pawnbrokers' duplicates, those turnpike tickets on the road of poverty. There is a crumpled paper smelling of opium, on which are scrawled rough memoranda, as took such a day, so many grains, took such another day, so many more, begun some time ago, as if with the intention of being regularly continued, but soon left off. There are a few dirty scraps of newspapers, all referring to coroners' inquests. There is nothing else. They search the cupboard and the drawer of the ink-splashed table. There is not a morsel of an old letter or of any other writing in either.
The young surgeon examines the dress on the law-writer. A knife and some odd halfpence are all he finds. Mr. Snagsby's suggestion is the practical suggestion after all, and the beadle must be called in. So the little crazy lodger goes for the beadle, and the rest come out of the room. "Don't leave the cat in there," says the surgeon. "That won't do." Mr. Krook therefore drives her out before him, and she goes furtively downstairs, winding her lithe tail and licking her lips. "Good night," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, and goes home to allegory and meditation. By this time the news has got into the court. Groups of its inhabitants assemble to discuss the thing, and the outposts of the army of observation, principally boys, are pushed forward to Mr. Krook's window, which they closely invest. A policeman has already walked up to the room and walked down again to the door, where he stands like a tower, only condescending to see the boys at his base occasionally, but whenever he does see them, they quail and fall back. Mrs. Perkins, who has not been for some weeks on speaking terms with Mrs. Piper, in consequence for an unpleasantness originating in young Perkins having fetched young Piper a crack, renews her friendly intercourse on this auspicious occasion. The pot-boy at the corner, who is a privileged amateur, as possessing official knowledge of life and having to deal with drunken men occasionally, exchanges confidential communications with the policeman and has the appearance of an impregnable youth, unassailable by truncheons and unconfinable in station-houses. People talk across the court out of window, and bare-headed scouts come hurrying in from Chancery Lane to know what's the matter. The general feeling seems to be that it's a blessing Mr. Krook warn't made away with first, mingled with a little natural disappointment that he was not. In the midst of this sensation, the beadle arrives. The beadle, though generally understood in the neighbourhood to be a ridiculous institution, is not without a certain popularity for the moment, if it were only as a man who is going to see the body. The policeman considers him an imbecile civilian, a remnant of the barbarous watchman times, but gives him admission as something that must be borne with until government shall abolish him. The sensation is heightened as the tidings spread from mouth to mouth that the beadle is on the ground and has gone in. By and by the beadle comes out, once more intensifying the sensation, which has rather languished in the interval. He is understood to be in want of witnesses for the inquest to-morrow, who can tell the coroner and jury anything whatever respecting the deceased. Is immediately referred to innumerable people who can tell nothing whatever. Is made more imbecile by being constantly informed that Mrs. Green's son was a law-writer himself and knowed him better than anybody, which son of Mrs. Green's appears on inquiry to be at the present time aboard a vessel bound for China, 3 months out, but considered accessible by telegraph on application to the Lords of the Admiralty. Beadle goes into various shops and parlours, examining the inhabitants, always shutting the door first, and by exclusion, delay, and general idiocy exasperating the public. Policeman seen to smile to pot-boy. Public loses interest and undergoes reaction. Taunts the beadle in shrill youthful voices with having boiled a boy. Choruses fragments of a popular song to that effect, and importing that the boy was made into soup for the workhouse. Policeman at last finds it necessary to support the law and seize the vocalist, who is released upon the flight of the rest, on condition of his getting out of this then, come, and cutting it, a condition he immediately observes. So the sensation dies off for the time, and the unmoved policeman, to whom a little opium more or less is nothing, with his shining hat, stiff stock, and flexible greatcoat, stout belt and bracelet, and all things fitting, pursues his lounging way with a heavy tread, beating the palms of his white gloves one against the other, and stopping now and then at a street corner to look casually about for anything between a lost child and a murder. Under cover of the night, the feeble-minded beadle comes flitting about Chancery Lane with his summonses, in which every juror's name is wrongly spelt, and nothing rightly spelt but the beadle's own name, which nobody can read or wants to know. The summons is served and his witnesses forewarned. The beadle goes to Mr. Krook's to keep a small appointment he has made with certain paupers, who, presently arriving, are conducted upstairs, where they leave the great eyes in the shutter something new to stare at, in that last shape which earthly lodgings take for no one, and for every one. And all that night the coffin stands ready by the old portmanteau, and the lonely figure on the bed, whose path in life has lain through 45 years, lies there with no more track behind him than any one can trace than a deserted infant. Next day the court is all alive, is like a fair, as Mrs. Perkins, more than reconciled to Mrs. Piper, says in amicable conversation with that excellent woman. The coroner is to sit in the first-floor room at the Sol's Arms, where the harmonic meetings take place twice a week, and where the chair is filled by a gentleman of professional celebrity, faced by Little Swills, the comic vocalist, who hopes, according to the bill in the window, that his friends will rally round him and support first-rate talent. The Sol's Arms does a brisk stroke of business all the morning. Even children so require sustaining under the general excitement that a pieman, who has established himself for the occasion at the corner of the court, says his brandy balls go off like smoke. What time the beadle, hovering between the door of Mr. Krook's establishment and the door of the Sol's Arms, shows the curiosity in his keeping to a few discreet spirits, and accepts the compliment of a glass of ale or so in return. At the appointed hour arrives the coroner, for whom the jurymen are waiting, and who is received with a salute of skittles from the good dry skittle-ground attached to the Sol's Arms. The coroner frequents more public houses than any man alive. The smell of sawdust, beer, tobacco smoke, and spirits is inseparable in his vocation from death in its most awful shapes. He is conducted by the beadle and the landlord to the harmonic meeting-room, where he puts his hat on the piano and takes a Windsor chair at the head of a long table, formed of several short tables put together and ornamented with glutinous rings in endless involutions made by pots and glasses. As many of the jury as can crowd together at the table sit there. The rest get among the spittoons and pipes or lean against the piano. Over the coroner's head is a small iron garland, the pendant handle of a bell, which rather gives the majesty of the court the appearance of going to be hanged presently. Call over and swear the jury. While the ceremony is in progress, sensation is created by the entrance of a chubby little man in a large shirt-collar, with a moist eye and an inflamed nose, who modestly takes a position near the door as one of the general public, but seems familiar with the room too. A whisper circulates that this is Little Swills. It is considered not unlikely that he will get up an imitation of the coroner and make it the principal feature of the harmonic meeting in the evening. "Well, gentlemen," the coroner begins.
"Silence there, will you?"
says the beadle, not to the coroner, though it might appear so.
"Well, gentlemen," resumes the coroner, "you are impanelled here to inquire into the death of a certain man. Evidence will be given before you as to the circumstances attending that death, and you will give your verdict according to the skittles. They must be stopped, you know, beadle. Evidence, and not according to anything else. The first thing to be done is to view the body." "Make way there!" cries the beadle. So they go out in a loose procession, something after the manner of a straggling funeral, and make their inspection in Mr. Krook's back second floor, from which a few of the jurymen retire pale and precipitately. The beadle is very careful that two gentlemen, not very neat about the cuffs and buttons, for whose accommodation he has provided a special little table near the coroner in a harmonic meeting-room, should see all that is to be seen. They are the public chroniclers of such inquiries by the line, and he is not superior to the universal human infirmity, but hopes to read in print what Mooney, the active and intelligent beadle of the district, said and did, and even aspires to see the name of Mooney as familiarly and patronizingly mentioned as the name of the hangman is according to the latest examples. Little Swills is waiting for the coroner and jury on their return. Mr. Tulkinghorn also. Mr. Tulkinghorn is received with distinction and seated near the coroner, between that high judicial officer, a bagatelle-board, and the coal-box. The inquiry proceeds. The jury learn how the subject of their inquiry died and learn no more about him. "A very eminent solicitor is in attendance, gentlemen,"
says the coroner,
who, I am informed, was accidentally present when discovery of the death was made, but he could only repeat the evidence you have already heard from the surgeon, the landlord, the lodger, and the law stationer, and it is not necessary to trouble him. Is anybody in attendance who knows anything more?" Mrs. Piper pushed forward by Mrs. Perkins. Mrs. Piper sworn. "Anastasia Piper, gentlemen, married woman, now Mrs. Piper. What have you got to say about this?"
Why, Mrs. Piper has a good deal to say, chiefly in parentheses and without punctuation, but not much to tell. Mrs. Piper lives in the court, which her husband is a cabinet-maker, and it has long been well beknown among the neighbours, counting from the day next but one before the half-baptizing of Alexander James Piper, aged 18 months and 4 days old, on accounts of not being expected to live, such was the sufferings, gentlemen, of that child in his gums, as the plaintiff. So Mrs. Piper insists on calling the deceased, was reported to have sold himself, thinks it was the plaintiff's heir in which that report originaten. See the plaintiff often, and considered as his heir was furiocious and not to be allowed to go about, some children being timid, and if doubted, hoping Mrs. Perkins may be brought forward, for she is here and will do credit to her husband and herself and family. Has seen the plaintiff vexed and worrited by the children, for children they will ever be, and you cannot expect them, especially if of playful dispositions, to be Methuselahs, which you was not yourself. On accounts of this and his dark looks, has often dreamed, as she see him, take a pickaxe from his pocket and split Johnny's head, which the child knows not fear, and has repeatedly called after him close at his heels. Never, however, see the plaintiff take a pickaxe or any other weapon, far from it. Has seen him hurry away when run and called after, as if not partial to children, and never see him speak to neither child nor grown person at any time, excepting the boy that sweeps the crossing down the lane over the way round the corner, which, if he was here, would tell you that he has been seen a-speaking to him frequent. Says the coroner, "Is that boy here?" Says the beadle, "No, sir, he is not here." Says the coroner, "Go and fetch him, then." In the absence of the active and intelligent, the coroner converses with Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Oh, here's the boy, gentlemen." Here he is, very muddy, very hoarse, very ragged. Now, boy, but stop a minute. Caution. This boy must be put through a few preliminary paces. Name, Joe. Nothing else that he knows on. Don't know that everybody has two names. Never heerd of sich a think. Don't know that Joe is short for a longer name. Thinks it's long enough for him. He don't find no fault with it. Spell it? No, he can't spell it. No father, no mother, no friends. Never been to school. What's home? Knows a broom's a broom, and knows it's wicked to tell a lie. Don't recollect who told him about the broom or about the lie, but knows both. Can't exactly say what'll be done to him arter he's dead if he tells a lie to the gentleman here, but believes it'll be something wery bad to punish him and serve him right, and so he'll tell the truth. "This won't do, gentlemen," says the coroner with a melancholy shake of the head. "Don't you think you can receive his evidence, sir?" asks an attentive juryman. "Out of the question," says the coroner. "You have heard the boy. Can't exactly say. Won't do, you know. We can't take that in a court of justice, gentlemen. It's terrible depravity. Put the boy aside." Boy put aside, to the great edification of the audience, especially of Little Swills, the comic vocalist. Now, is there any other witness? No other witness. Very well, gentlemen. Here's a man unknown, proved to have been in the habit of taking opium in large quantities for a year and a half, found dead of too much opium. If you think you have any evidence to lead you to the conclusion that he committed suicide, you will come to that conclusion. If you think it is a case of accidental death, you will find a verdict accordingly. Verdict accordingly. Accidental death. No doubt. Gentlemen, you are discharged. Good afternoon. While the coroner buttons his greatcoat, Mr. Tulkinghorn and he give private audience to the rejected witness in a corner. That graceless creature only knows that the dead man, whom he recognized just now by his yellow face and black hair, was sometimes hooted and pursued about the streets. That one cold winter night, when he, the boy, was shivering in a doorway near his crossing, the man turned to look at him and came back, and having questioned him and found that he had not a friend in the world, said, "Neither have I, not one," and gave him the price of a supper and a night's lodging. That the man had often spoken to him since, and asked him whether he slept sound at night, and how he bore cold and hunger, and whether he ever wished to die, and similar strange questions. That when the man had no money, he would say in passing, "I am poor as you to-day, Joe," but that when he had any, he had always, as the boy most heartily believes, been glad to give him some.
"He was wery good to me," says the boy, wiping his eyes with his wretched sleeve. "When I see him a-laying so stretched out just now, I wished he could have heerd me tell him so. He was wery good to me, he was."
As he shuffles downstairs, Mr. Snagsby, lying in wait for him, puts a half-crown in his hand.
"If you ever see me coming past your crossing with my little woman, I mean a lady," says Mr. Snagsby with his finger on his nose, "don't allude to it."
For some little time the jurymen hang about the Sol's Arms colloquially. In the sequel, half a dozen are caught up in a cloud of pipe smoke that pervades the parlour of the Sol's Arms. 2 stroll to Hampstead, and 4 engage to go half-price to the play at night and top up with oysters. Little Swills is treated on several hands. Being asked what he thinks of the proceedings, characterizes them, his strength lying in a slangular direction, as a rummy start. The landlord of the Sol's Arms, finding Little Swills so popular, commends him highly to the jurymen and public, observing that for a song in character he don't know his equal, and that man's character wardrobe would fill a cart. Thus gradually the Sol's Arms melts into the shadowy night and then flares out of it strong in gas. The harmonic meeting hour arriving, the gentleman of professional celebrity takes the chair, is faced, red-faced, by Little Swills. Their friends rally round them and support first-rate talent. In the zenith of the evening, Little Swills says,
"Gentlemen, if you'll permit me, I'll attempt a short description of a scene of real life that came off here to-day."
Is much applauded and encouraged. Goes out of the room as Swills, comes in as the coroner, not the least in the world like him. Describes the inquest, with recreative intervals of pianoforte accompaniment to the refrain, with his, the coroner's, tippy-toll-ly-doll, tippy-toll-lo-doll, tippy-toll-ly-doll, D. The jingling piano at last is silent, and the harmonic friends rally round their pillows. Then there is rest around the lonely figure now laid in its last earthly habitation, and it is watched by the gaunt eyes in the shutters through some quiet hours of night. If this forlorn man could have been prophetically seen lying here by the mother at whose breast he nestled, a little child, with eyes upraised to her loving face, and soft hands scarcely knowing how to close upon the neck to which it crept, what an impossibility the vision would have seemed! Oh, if in brighter days the now extinguished fire within him ever burned for one woman who held him in her heart! Where is she, while these ashes are above the ground? It is anything but a night of rest at Mr. Snagsby's in Cook's Court, where Guster murders sleep by going, as Mr. Snagsby himself allows, not to put too fine a point upon it, out of 1 fit into 20. The occasion of this seizure is that Guster has a tender heart and a susceptible something that possibly might have been imagination, but for Tooting and her patron saint. Be it what it may, now it was so direfully impressed at tea-time by Mr. Snagsby's account of the inquiry at which he had assisted that at supper-time she projected herself into the kitchen, preceded by a flying Dutch cheese, and fell into a fit of unusual duration, which she only came out of to go into another, and so on through a chain of fits with short intervals between, of which she has pathetically availed herself by consuming them in entreaties to Mrs. Snagsby not to give her warning when she quite comes to, and also in appeals to the whole establishment to lay her down on the stones and go to bed. Hence Mr. Snagsby, at last hearing the cock at the little dairy in Cursitor Street go into that disinterested ecstasy of his on the subject of daylight, says, drawing a long breath, though the most patient of men, "I thought you was dead, I'm sure." What question this enthusiastic fowl supposes he settles when he strains himself to such an extent, or why he should thus crow, so men crow on various triumphant public occasions, however, about what cannot be of any moment to him, is his affair. It is enough that daylight comes, morning comes, noon comes. Then the active and intelligent, who has got into the morning papers as such, comes with his pauper company to Mr. Krook's and bears off the body of our dear brother here departed to a hemmed-in churchyard, pestiferous and obscene, whence malignant diseases are communicated to the bodies of our dear brothers and sisters who have not departed, while our dear brothers and sisters who hang about official back-stairs, would to heaven they had departed, are very complacent and agreeable. Into a beastly scrap of ground which a Turk would reject as a savage abomination and a Caffre would shudder at, they bring our dear brother, here departed, to receive Christian burial. With houses looking on every side, save where a reeking little tunnel of a court gives access to the iron gate, with every villainy of life in action close on death, and every poisonous element of death in action close on life, here they lower our dear brother down a foot or two, here sow him in corruption, to be raised in corruption, an avenging ghost at many a sick bedside, a shameful testimony to future ages how civilization and barbarism walked this boastful island together. Come night, come darkness, for you cannot come too soon or stay too long by such a place as this, come straggling lights into the windows of the ugly houses, and you who do iniquity therein, do it at least with this dread scene shut out. Come, flame of gas, burning so sullenly above the iron gate, on which the poisoned air deposits its witch ointment, slimy to the touch, it is well that you should call to every passer-by, "Look here!" With the night comes a slouching figure through the tunnel court to the outside of the iron gate. It holds the gate with its hands and looks in between the bars, stands looking in for a little while. It then, with an old broom it carries, softly sweeps the step and makes the archway clean. It does so very busily and trimly, looks in again a little while, and so departs. "Jo, is it thou? Well, well, thou a rejected witness, who can't exactly say what will be done to him in greater hands than men's, thou art not quite in outer darkness. There is something like a distant ray of light in thy muttered reason for this. He was very good to me, he was." End of chapter 11. Of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 12. On the Watch. It has left off raining down in Lincolnshire at last, and Chesney Wold has taken heart. Mrs. Rouncewell is full of hospitable cares, for Sir Leicester and my Lady are coming home from Paris. The fashionable intelligence has found it out, and communicates the glad tidings to benighted England. It has also found out that they will entertain a brilliant and distinguished circle of the elite of the beau monde. The fashionable intelligence is weak in English, but a giant refreshed in French, at the ancient and hospitable family seat in Lincolnshire. For the greater honour of the brilliant and distinguished circle, and of Chesney Wold into the bargain, the broken arch of the bridge in the park is mended, and the water, now retired within its proper limits and again spanned gracefully, makes a figure in the prospect from the house. The clear, cold sunshine glances into the brittle woods and approvingly beholds the sharp wind scattering the leaves and drying the moss. It glides over the park after the moving shadows of the clouds and chases them and never catches them all day. It looks in at the windows and touches the ancestral portraits with bars and patches of brightness never contemplated by the painters. Athwart the picture of my Lady, over the great chimney-piece, it throws a broad bend sinister of light that strikes down crookedly into the hearth and seems to rend it. Through the same cold sunshine and the sharp wind, my Lady and Sir Leicester, in their travelling chariot, my Lady's woman and Sir Leicester's man affectionate in the rumble, start for home. With a considerable amount of jingling and whip-cracking, and many plunging demonstrations on the part of 2 bare-backed horses and 2 centaurs with glazed hats, jack-boots, and flowing manes and tails, they rattle out of the yard of the Hotel Bristol in the Place Vendôme and canter between the sun and shadow-chequered colonnade of the Rue de Rivoli and the garden of the ill-fated palace of a headless king and queen, off by the Place of Concorde and the Elysian Fields and the Gate of the Star, out of Paris. Sooth to say, they cannot go away too fast, for even here my Lady Dedlock has been bored to death. Concert, assembly, opera, theatre, drive, nothing is new to my Lady under the worn-out heavens. Only last Sunday, when poor wretches were gay, within the walls playing with children among the clipped trees and the statues in the palace garden, walking a score abreast in the Elysian Fields, made more Elysian by performing dogs and wooden horses, between whiles filtering a few through the gloomy cathedral of Our Lady to say a word or two at the base of a pillar, within flare of a rusty little gridiron full of gusty little tapers, without the walls encompassing Paris with dancing, love-making, wine-drinking, tobacco-smoking, tomb-visiting, billiard-card and domino-playing, quack-doctoring, and much murderous refuse, animate and inanimate. Only last Sunday my Lady, in the desolation of boredom and the clutch of giant despair, almost hated her own maid for being in spirits. She cannot, therefore, go too fast from Paris. Weariness of soul lies before her, as it lies behind. Her Ariel has put a girdle of it round the whole earth, and it cannot be unclasped. But the imperfect remedy is always to fly from the last place where it has been experienced. Fling Paris back into the distance, then exchanging it for endless avenues and cross-avenues of wintry trees, and, when next beheld, let it be some leagues away, with the Gate of the Star a white speck glittering in the sun, and the city a mere mound in a plain, 2 dark square towers rising out of it, and light and shadow descending on it aslant, like the angels in Jacob's dream. Sir Leicester is generally in a complacent state and rarely bored. When he has nothing else to do, he can always contemplate his own greatness. It is a considerable advantage to a man to have so inexhaustible a subject. After reading his letters, he leans back in his corner of the carriage and generally reviews his importance to society. "You have an unusual amount of correspondence this morning," says my Lady after a long time. She is fatigued with reading, has almost read a page in 20 miles. "Nothing in it, though. Nothing whatever." "I saw one of Mr. Tulkinghorn's long effusions, I think." "You see everything," says Sir Leicester with admiration. "Ha!" sighs my Lady. "He is the most tiresome of men." "He sends, I really beg your pardon, he sends," says Sir Leicester, selecting the letter and unfolding it, "a message to you. Stopping to change horses as I came to his postscript. Drove it out of my memory. I beg you'll excuse me," he says. Sir Leicester is so long in taking out his eyeglass and adjusting it that my Lady looks a little irritated. "He says, in the matter of the right-of-way. I beg your pardon, that's not the place. He says, yes, here I have it. He says, I beg my respectful compliments to my Lady, who I hope has benefited by the change. Will you do me the favour to mention, as it may interest her, that I have something to tell her on her return in reference to the person who copied the affidavit in the Chancery suit, which so powerfully stimulated her curiosity? I have seen him." My Lady, leaning forward, looks out of her window. "That's the message," observes Sir Leicester. "I should like to walk a little," says my Lady, still looking out of her window. "Walk?" repeats Sir Leicester in a tone of surprise. "I should like to walk a little," says my Lady with unmistakable distinctness. "Please to stop the carriage." The carriage is stopped. The affectionate man alights from the rumble, opens the door, and lets down the steps, obedient to an impatient motion of my Lady's hand. My Lady alights so quickly and walks away so quickly that Sir Leicester, for all his scrupulous politeness, is unable to assist her and is left behind. A space of a minute or two has elapsed before he comes up with her. She smiles, looks very handsome, takes his arm, lounges with him for a quarter of a mile, is very much bored, and resumes her seat in the carriage. The rattle and clatter continue through the greater part of 3 days, with more or less of bell jingling and whip cracking, and more or less plunging of centaurs and bare-backed horses. Their courtly politeness to each other at the hotels where they tarry is the theme of general admiration. Though my lord is a little aged for my Lady, says Madam, the hostess of the Golden Ape, and though he might be her amiable father, one can see at a glance that they love each other. One observes my lord with his white hair standing hat in hand to help my Lady to and from the carriage. One observes my Lady, how recognizant of my lord's politeness, with an inclination of her gracious head and the concession of her so genteel fingers. It is ravishing. The sea has no appreciation of great men, but knocks them about like the small fry. It is habitually hard upon Sir Leicester, whose countenance it greenly mottles in the manner of sage cheese, and in whose aristocratic system it effects a dismal revolution. It is the radical of nature to him. Nevertheless, his dignity gets over it after stopping to refit, and he goes on with my Lady for Chesney Wold, lying only one night in London on the way to Lincolnshire. Through the same cold sunlight, colder as the day declines, and through the same sharp wind, sharper as the separate shadows of bare trees gloom together in the woods, and as the ghosts walk, touched at the western corner by a pile of fire in the sky, resigns itself to coming night, they drive into the park. The rooks, swinging in their lofty houses in the elm-tree avenue, seem to discuss the question of the occupancy of the carriage as it passes underneath, some agreeing that Sir Leicester and my Lady are come down, some arguing with malcontents who won't admit it, now all consenting to consider the question disposed of, now all breaking out again in violent debate, incited by one obstinate and drowsy bird who will persist in putting in a last contradictory croak. Leaving them to swing and caw, the travelling chariot rolls on to the house, where fires gleam warmly through some of the windows, though not through so many as to give an inhabited expression to the darkening mass of front. But the brilliant and distinguished circle will soon do that. Mrs. Rouncewell is in attendance and receives Sir Leicester's customary shake of the hand with a profound curtsy. "How do you do, Mrs. Rouncewell? I am glad to see you."
"I hope I have the honour of welcoming you in good health, Sir Leicester."
"In excellent health, Mrs. Rouncewell."
"My Lady is looking charmingly well," says Mrs. Rouncewell with another curtsy.
My Lady signifies, without profuse expenditure of words, that she is as wearily well as she can hope to be. But Rosa is in the distance, behind the housekeeper, and my Lady, who has not subdued the quickness of her observation, whatever else she may have conquered, asks, "Who is that girl?"
"A young scholar of mine, my Lady, Rosa."
"Come here, Rosa." Lady Dedlock beckons her with even an appearance of interest. "Why, do you know how pretty you are, child?" she says, touching her shoulder with her 2 forefingers. Rosa, very much abashed, says,
"No, if you please, my Lady,"
and glances up and glances down and don't know where to look, but looks all the prettier. "How old are you?"
19, my Lady.
19, repeats my Lady thoughtfully. "Take care they don't spoil you by flattery."
"Yes, my Lady."
My Lady taps her dimpled cheek with the same delicate gloved fingers and goes on to the foot of the oak staircase, where Sir Leicester pauses for her as her nightly escort. A staring old Dedlock in a panel, as large as life and as dull, looked as if he didn't know what to make of it, which was probably his general state of mind in the days of Queen Elizabeth. That evening, in the housekeeper's room, Rosa could do nothing but murmur Lady Dedlock's praises. She is so affable, so graceful, so beautiful, so elegant, has such a sweet voice and such a thrilling touch that Rosa can feel it yet. Mrs. Rouncewell confirms all this, not without personal pride, reserving only the one point of affability. Mrs. Rouncewell is not quite sure as to that. Heaven forbid that she should say a syllable in dispraise of any member of that excellent family, above all of my Lady, whom the whole world admires. But if my Lady would only be a little more free, not quite so cold and distant, Mrs. Rouncewell thinks she would be more affable.
"'Tis almost a pity,"
Mrs. Rouncewell adds, only almost, because it borders on impiety to suppose that anything could be better than it is in such an express dispensation as the Dedlock affairs.
"that my Lady has no family. If she had had a daughter now, a grown young lady to interest her, I think she would have had the only kind of excellence she wants."
Might not that have made her still more proud, grandmother? Says Watt, who has been home and come back again, he is such a good grandson.
"More and most, my dear," returns the housekeeper with dignity, "are words it's not my place to use, nor so much as to hear, applied to any drawback on my Lady."
I beg your pardon, grandmother, but she is proud, is she not?
"If she is, she has reason to be. The Dedlock family have always reason to be."
Well," says Watt, "it's to be hoped they line out of their prayer books a certain passage for the common people about pride and vainglory. Forgive me, grandmother, only a joke."
"Sir Leicester and Lady Dedlock, my dear, are not fit subjects for joking."
"Sir Leicester is no joke by any means," says Watt, "and I humbly ask his pardon. I suppose, grandmother, that even with the family and their guests down here, there is no objection to my prolonging my stay at the Dedlock Arms for a day or two, as any other traveller might?"
"Surely none in the world, child."
"I'm glad of that," says Watt, "because I have an inexpressible desire to extend my knowledge of this beautiful neighbourhood." He happens to glance at Rosa, who looks down and is very shy indeed. But according to the old superstition, it should be Rosa's ears that burn, and not her fresh bright cheeks, for my Lady's maid is holding forth about her at this moment with surpassing energy. My Lady's maid is a Frenchwoman of 32, from somewhere in the southern country about Avignon and Marseille, a large-eyed brown woman with black hair who would be handsome but for a certain feline mouth and general uncomfortable tightness of face, rendering the jaws too eager and the skull too prominent. There is something indefinably keen and wan about her anatomy, and she has a watchful way of looking out of the corners of her eyes without turning her head, which could be pleasantly dispensed with, especially when she is in an ill humour and near knives. Through all the good taste of her dress and little adornments, these objections so express themselves that she seems to go about like a very neat she-wolf, imperfectly tamed. Besides being accomplished in all the knowledge appertaining to her post, she is almost an Englishwoman in her acquaintance with the language. Consequently, she is in no want of words to shower upon Rosa for having attracted my Lady's attention, and she pours them out with such grim ridicule as she sits at dinner that her companion, the affectionate man, is rather relieved when she arrives at the spoon stage of that performance. Ha, ha, ha! She, Hortense, been in my lady's service since 5 years, and always kept at the distance. And this doll, this puppet, caressed, absolutely caressed, by my lady on the moment of her arriving at the house. Ha, ha, ha! And do you know how pretty you are, child? No, my lady, you are right there. And how old are you, child? And take care they do not spoil you by flattery, child. Oh, how droll! It is the best thing altogether. In short, it is such an admirable thing that Mademoiselle Hortense can't forget it. But at meals for days afterwards, even among her countrywomen and others attached in like capacity to the troop of visitors, relapses into silent enjoyment of the joke, an enjoyment expressed in her own convivial manner by an additional tightness of face, thin elongation of compressed lips, and sidewise look, which intense appreciation of humour is frequently reflected in my Lady's mirrors when my Lady is not among them. All the mirrors in the house are brought into action now, many of them after a long blank. They reflect handsome faces, simpering faces, youthful faces, faces of 70 that will not submit to be old, the entire collection of faces that have come to pass a January week or two at Chesney Wold, and which the fashionable intelligence, a mighty hunter before the Lord, hunts with a keen scent from their breaking cover at the court of St. James's to their being run down to death. The place in Lincolnshire is all alive. By day, guns and voices are heard ringing in the woods, horsemen and carriages enliven the park roads, servants and hangers-on pervade the village and the Dedlock Arms. Seen by night from distant openings in the trees, the row of windows in the long drawing-room, where my Lady's picture hangs over the great chimney-piece, is like a row of jewels set in a black frame. On Sunday the chill little church is almost warmed by so much gallant company, and the general flavour of the Dedlock dust is quenched in delicate perfumes. The brilliant and distinguished circle comprehends within it no contracted amount of education, sense, courage, honour, beauty, and virtue, yet there is something a little wrong about it in despite of its immense advantages. What can it be? Dandyism? There is no King George the Fourth now, more the pity, to set the dandy fashion. There are no clear-starched jack-towel neckcloths, no short-waisted coats, no false calves, no stays. There are no caricatures now of effeminate exquisites so arrayed, swooning in opera-boxes with excessive delight and being revived by other dainty creatures poking long-necked scent-bottles at their noses. There is no beau whom it takes 4 men at once to shake into his buckskins, or who goes to see all the executions, or who is troubled with the self-reproach of having once consumed a pea. But is there dandyism in the brilliant and distinguished circle notwithstanding? Dandyism of a more mischievous sort, that has got below the surface and is doing less harmless things than jack-toweling itself and stopping its own digestion, to which no rational person need particularly object? Why, yes, it cannot be disguised. There are, at Chesney Wold this January week, some ladies and gentlemen of the newest fashion who have set up a dandyism, in religion, for instance, who in mere lackadaisical want of an emotion have agreed upon a little dandy talk about the vulgar wanting faith in things in general, meaning in the things that have been tried and found wanting, as though a low fellow should unaccountably lose faith in a bad shilling after finding it out, who would make the vulgar very picturesque and faithful by putting back the hands upon the clock of time and cancelling a few 100 years of history. There are also ladies and gentlemen of another fashion, not so new, but very elegant, who have agreed to put a smooth glaze on the world and to keep down all its realities, for whom everything must be languid and pretty, who have found out the perpetual stoppage, who are to rejoice at nothing and be sorry for nothing, who are not to be disturbed by ideas, on whom even the fine arts, attending in powder and walking backwards like the Lord Chamberlain, must array themselves in the milliners' and tailors' patterns of past generations, and be particularly careful not to be in earnest or to receive any impress from the moving age. Then there is my Lord Boodle, of considerable reputation with his party, who has known what office is and who tells Sir Leicester Dedlock with much gravity after dinner that he really does not see to what the present age is tending. A debate is not what a debate used to be. The House is not what the House used to be. Even a cabinet is not what it formerly was. He perceives with astonishment that supposing the present government to be overthrown, the limited choice of the Crown in the formation of a new ministry would lie between Lord Coodle and Sir Thomas Doodle, supposing it to be impossible for the Duke of Foodle to act with Goodle, which may be assumed to be the case in consequence of the breach arising out of that affair with Hoodle. Then, giving the Home Department and the leadership of the House of Commons to Joodle, the Exchequer to Coodle, the Colonies to Loodle, and the Foreign Office to Moodle, what are you to do with Noodle? You can't offer him the presidency of the council. That is reserved for Poodle. You can't put him in the woods and forests. That is hardly good enough for Coodle. What follows? That the country is shipwrecked, lost, and gone to pieces, as is made manifest to the patriotism of Sir Leicester Dedlock, because you can't provide for Noodle. On the other hand, the Right Honourable William Buffy, M.P., contends across the table with some one else that the shipwreck of the country, about which there is no doubt, it is only the manner of it that is in question, is attributable to Cuffy. If you had done with Cuffy what you ought to have done when he first came into Parliament and had prevented him from going over to Duffy, you would have got him into alliance with Fuffy. You would have had with you the weight attaching as a smart debater to Guffy. You would have brought to bear upon the elections the wealth of Huffy. You would have got in for 3 counties, Juffy, Cuffy, and Luffy, and you would have strengthened your administration by the official knowledge and the business habits of Muffy. All this, instead of being, as you now are, dependent on the mere caprice of Puffy. As to this point, and as to some minor topics, there are differences of opinion. But it is perfectly clear to the brilliant and distinguished circle, all round, that nobody is in question about Boodle and his retinue, and Buffy and his retinue. These are the great actors for whom the stage is reserved. A people that are, no doubt, a certain large number of supernumeraries who are to be occasionally addressed and relied upon for shouts and choruses as on the theatrical stage. But Boodle and Buffy, their followers and families, their heirs, executors, administrators, and assigns, are the born first actors, managers, and leaders, and no others can appear upon the scene for ever and ever. In this, too, there is perhaps more dandyism at Chesney Wold than the brilliant and distinguished circle will find good for itself in the long run. For it is, even with the stillest and politest circles, as with the circle the necromancer draws around him, very strange appearances may be seen in active motion outside. With this difference, that being realities and not phantoms, there is the greater danger of their breaking in. Chesney Wold is quite full anyhow, so full that a burning sense of injury arises in the breasts of ill-lodged ladies' maids and is not to be extinguished. Only one room is empty. It is a turret chamber of the 3rd order of merit, plainly but comfortably furnished and having an old-fashioned business air. It is Mr. Tulkinghorn's room and is never bestowed on anybody else, for he may come at any time. He is not come yet. It is his quiet habit to walk across the park from the village in fine weather, to drop into his room as if he had never been out of it since he was last seen there, to request a servant to inform Sir Leicester that he has arrived in case he should be wanted, and to appear 10 minutes before dinner in the shadow of the library door. He sleeps in his turret with a complaining flagstaff over his head, and has some leads outside on which, any fine morning when he is down here, his black figure may be seen walking before breakfast like a larger species of rook. Every day before dinner, my Lady looks for him in the dusk of the library, but he is not there. Every day at dinner my Lady glances down the table for the vacant place that would be waiting to receive him if he had just arrived. But there is no vacant place. Every night my Lady casually asks her maid, "Is Mr. Tulkinghorn come?" Every night the answer is, "No, my Lady, not yet." One night, while having her hair undressed, my Lady loses herself in deep thought after this reply until she sees her own brooding face in the opposite glass and a pair of black eyes curiously observing her. "Be so good as to attend," says my Lady, then addressing the reflection of Hortense, "to your business. You can contemplate your beauty at another time." "Oh, pardon! It was your ladyship's beauty." "That," says my Lady, "you needn't contemplate at all." At length, one afternoon, a little before sunset, when the bright groups of figures which have for the last hour or two enlivened the Ghost's Walk are all dispersed, and only Sir Leicester and my Lady remain upon the terrace, Mr. Tulkinghorn appears. He comes toward them at his usual methodical pace, which is never quickened, never slackened. He wears his usual expressionless mask, if it be a mask, and carries family secrets in every limb of his body and every crease of his dress. Whether his whole soul is devoted to the great, or whether he yields them nothing beyond the services he sells, is his personal secret. He keeps it, as he keeps the secrets of his clients. He is his own client in that matter and will never betray himself. "How do you do, Mr. Tulkinghorn?" says Sir Leicester, giving him his hand. Mr. Tulkinghorn is quite well. Sir Leicester is quite well. My Lady is quite well. All highly satisfactory. The lawyer, with his hands behind him, walks at Sir Leicester's side along the terrace. My Lady walks upon the other side. "We expected you before," says Sir Leicester. A gracious observation, as much as to say, "Mr. Tulkinghorn, we remember your existence when you are not here to remind us of it by your presence. We bestow a fragment of our minds upon you, sir, you see." Mr. Tulkinghorn, comprehending it, inclines his head and says he is much obliged. "I should have come down sooner," he explains, "but that I have been much engaged with those matters in the several suits between yourself and Boythorn." "A man of a very ill-regulated mind," observes Sir Leicester with severity. "An extremely dangerous person in any community. A man of a very low character of mind." "He is obstinate," says Mr. Tulkinghorn. "It is natural to such a man to be so," says Sir Leicester, looking most profoundly obstinate himself. "I am not at all surprised to hear it." "The only question is," pursues the lawyer, "whether you will give up anything." "No, sir," replies Sir Leicester. "Nothing I give up." "I don't mean anything of importance. That, of course, I know you would not abandon. I mean any minor point." "Mr. Tulkinghorn," returns Sir Leicester, "there can be no minor point between myself and Mr. Boythorn. If I go farther and observe that I cannot readily conceive how any right of mine can be a minor point, I speak not so much in reference to myself as an individual as in reference to the family position I have in charge to maintain." Mr. Tulkinghorn inclines his head again. "I have now my instructions," he says. "Mr. Boythorn will give us a good deal of trouble." "It is the character of such a mind, Mr. Tulkinghorn," Sir Leicester interrupts him, "to give trouble. An exceedingly ill-conditioned, levelling person. A person who 50 years ago would probably have been tried at the Old Bailey for some demagogue proceeding and severely punished. If not," adds Sir Leicester after a moment's pause, "if not hanged, drawn, and quartered." Sir Leicester appears to discharge his stately breast of a burden in passing this capital sentence as if it were the next satisfactory thing to having the sentence executed. "But night is coming on," says he, "and my Lady will take cold. My dear, let us go in." As they turn towards the hall door, Lady Dedlock addresses Mr. Tulkinghorn for the first time. "You sent me a message respecting the person whose writing I happened to inquire about. It was like you to remember the circumstances. I had quite forgotten it. Your message reminded me of it again. I can't imagine what association I had with a hand like that, but surely I had some." "You had some?" Mr. Tulkinghorn repeats. "Oh, yes," returns my Lady carelessly. "I think I must have had some. And did you really take the trouble to find out the writer of that actual thing? What is it? Affidavit?" "Yes." "How very odd." They pass into a sombre breakfast-room on the ground floor, lighted in the day by 2 deep windows. It is now twilight. The fire glows brightly on the panelled wall and palely on the window-glass, where, through the cold reflection of the blaze, the colder landscape shudders in the wind, and a grey mist creeps along, the only traveller besides the waste of clouds. My Lady lounges in a great chair in the chimney-corner, and Sir Leicester takes another great chair opposite. The lawyer stands before the fire with his hand out at arm's length, shading his face. He looks across his arm at my Lady. "Yes," he says, "I inquired about the man and found him, and, what is very strange, I found him—" "Not to be any out-of-the-way person, I am afraid," Lady Dedlock languidly anticipates. "I found him dead." "Oh, dear me!" remonstrated Sir Leicester, not so much shocked by the fact as by the fact of the fact being mentioned. "I was directed to his lodging, a miserable, poverty-stricken place, and I found him dead." "You will excuse me, Mr. Tulkinghorn," observes Sir Leicester. "I think the less said—" "Pray, Sir Leicester, let me hear the story out." It is my Lady speaking. "It is quite a story for twilight. How very shocking! Dead?" Mr. Tulkinghorn reasserts it by another inclination of his head. "Whether by his own hand—" "Upon my honour!" cries Sir Leicester. "Really!" "Do let me hear the story," says my Lady. "Whatever you desire, my dear, but I must say—" "No, you mustn't say. Go on, Mr. Tulkinghorn." Sir Leicester's gallantry concedes the point, though he still feels that to bring this sort of squalor among the upper classes is really, "I was about to say," resumes the lawyer with undisturbed calmness, "that whether he had died by his own hand or not, it was beyond my power to tell you. I should amend that phrase, however, by saying that he had unquestionably died of his own act, though whether by his own deliberate intention or by mischance can never certainly be known. The coroner's jury found that he took the poison accidentally." "And what kind of man," my Lady asks, "was this deplorable creature?" "Very difficult to say," returns the lawyer, shaking his head. "He had lived so wretchedly and was so neglected, with his gipsy colour and his wild black hair and beard, that I should have considered him the commonest of the common. The surgeon had a notion that he had once been something better, both in appearance and condition." "What did they call the wretched being?" "They called him what he had called himself, but no one knew his name." "Not even any one who had attended on him?" "No one had attended on him. He was found dead. In fact, I found him." "Without any clue to anything more?" "Without any. There was," says the lawyer meditatively, "an old portmanteau, but no, there were no papers." During the utterance of every word of this short dialogue, Lady Dedlock and Mr. Tulkinghorn, without any other alteration in their customary deportment, have looked very steadily at one another, as was natural, perhaps, in the discussion of so unusual a subject. Sir Leicester has looked at the fire with the general expression of the Dedlock on the staircase. The story being told, he renews his stately protest, saying that as it is quite clear that no association in my Lady's mind can possibly be traceable to this poor wretch unless he was a begging letter-writer, he trusts to hear no more about a subject so far removed from my Lady's station. "Certainly a collection of horrors," says my Lady, gathering up her mantles and furs, "but they interest one for the moment. Have the kindness, Mr. Tulkinghorn, to open the door for me." Mr. Tulkinghorn does so with deference and holds it open while she passes out. She passes close to him with her usual fatigued manner and insolent grace. They meet again at dinner, again, next day, again, for many days in succession. Lady Dedlock is always the same exhausted deity, surrounded by worshippers, and terribly liable to be bored to death, even while presiding at her own shrine. Mr. Tulkinghorn is always the same speechless repository of noble confidences, so oddly out of place and yet so perfectly at home. They appear to take as little note of one another as any two people enclosed within the same walls could. But whether each evermore watches and suspects the other, ever more mistrustful of some great reservation, whether each is ever more prepared at all points for the other, and never to be taken unawares, what each would give to know how much the other knows, all this is hidden for the time in their own hearts. End of chapter 12. Of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. Esther's Narrative. We held many consultations about what Richard was to be, first without Mr. Jarndyce as he had requested, and afterwards with him, but it was a long time before we seemed to make progress. Richard said he was ready for anything. When Mr. Jarndyce doubted whether he might not already be too old to enter the navy, Richard said he had thought of that, and perhaps he was. When Mr. Jarndyce asked him what he thought of the army, Richard said he had thought of that too, and it wasn't a bad idea. When Mr. Jarndyce advised him to try and decide within himself whether his old preference for the sea was an ordinary boyish inclination or a strong impulse, Richard answered, well, he really had tried very often, and he couldn't make out. "How much of this indecision of character," Mr. Jarndyce said to me, "is chargeable on that incomprehensible heap of uncertainty and procrastination on which he has been thrown from his birth, I don't pretend to say. But that Chancery, among its other sins, is responsible for some of it, I can plainly see. It has engendered or confirmed in him a habit of putting off, and trusting to this, that, and the other chance without knowing what chance, and dismissing everything as unsettled, uncertain, and confused. The character of much older and steadier people may be even changed by the circumstances surrounding them. It would be too much to expect that a boy's, in its formation, should be the subject of such influences and escape them." I felt this to be true, though if I may venture to mention what I thought besides, I thought it much to be regretted that Richard's education had not counteracted those influences or directed his character. He had been 8 years at a public school and had learnt, I understood, to make Latin verses of several sorts in the most admirable manner. But I never heard that it had been anybody's business to find out what his natural bent was, or where his failings lay, or to adapt any kind of knowledge to him. He had been adapted to the verses and had learnt the art of making them to such perfection that if he had remained at school until he was of age, I suppose he could only have gone on making them over and over again, unless he had enlarged his education by forgetting how to do it. Still, although I had no doubt that they were very beautiful and very improving and very sufficient for a great many purposes of life, and always remembered all through life, I did doubt whether Richard would not have profited by some one studying him a little instead of his studying them quite so much.
To be sure, I knew nothing of the subject, and do not even now know whether the young gentlemen of classic Rome or Greece made verses to the same extent, or whether the young gentlemen of any country ever did.
"I haven't the least idea,"
said Richard, musing,
"what I had better be, except that I am quite sure I don't want to go into the church. It's a toss-up." "You have no inclination in Mr. Kenge's way?"
suggested Mr. Jarndyce.
"I don't know that, sir,"
replied Richard.
"I'm fond of boating. Articled clerks do a good deal on the water. It's a capital profession." "A surgeon?"
suggested Mr. Jarndyce.
"That's the thing, sir,"
cried Richard. I doubt if he had ever once thought of it before. "That's the thing, sir," repeated Richard with the greatest enthusiasm.
"We have got it at last. M.R.C.S."
He was not to be laughed out of it, though he laughed at it heartily. He said he had chosen his profession, and the more he thought of it, the more he felt that his destiny was clear. The art of healing was the art of all others for him. Mistrusting that he only came to this conclusion because, having never had much chance of finding out for himself what he was fitted for, and having never been guided to the discovery, he was taken by the newest idea and was glad to get rid of the trouble of consideration. I wondered whether the Latin verses often ended in this, or whether Richard's was a solitary case. Mr. Jarndyce took great pains to talk with him seriously and to put it to his good sense not to deceive himself in so important a matter. Richard was a little grave after these interviews, but invariably told Ada and me that it was all right, and then began to talk about something else.
"By heaven!"
cried Mr. Boythorn, who interested himself strongly in the subject, though I need not say that, for he could do nothing weakly.
"I rejoice to find a young gentleman of spirit and gallantry devoting himself to that noble profession. The more the spirit there is in it, the better for mankind, and the worse for those mercenary taskmasters and low tricksters who delight in putting that illustrious art at a disadvantage in the world. By all that's base and despicable,"
cried Mr. Boythorn,
"the treatment of surgeons aboard ship is such that I would submit the legs, both legs, of every member of the Admiralty Board to a compound fracture, and render it a transportable offence in any qualified practitioner to set them, if the system were not wholly changed in 48 hours."
"Wouldn't you give them a week?"
asked Mr. Jarndyce.
"No,"
cried Mr. Boythorn firmly,
"not on any consideration. 48 hours. As to corporations, parishes, vestry boards, and similar gatherings of jolter-headed clods, who assemble to exchange such speeches that, by heaven, they ought to be worked in quicksilver mines for the short remainder of their miserable existence, if it were only to prevent their detestable English from contaminating a language spoken in the presence of the sun, as to those fellows who meanly take advantage of the ardour of gentlemen in the pursuit of knowledge to recompense the inestimable services of the best years of their lives, their long study, and their expensive education with pittances too small for the acceptance of clerks, I would have the necks of every one of them wrung and their skulls arranged in Surgeons' Hall for the contemplation of the whole profession, in order that its younger members might understand, from actual measurement in early life, how thick skulls may become."
He wound up this vehement declaration by looking round upon us with a most agreeable smile and suddenly thundering, over and over again, until anybody else might have been expected to be quite subdued by the exertion. As Richard still continued to say that he was fixed in his choice, after repeated periods for consideration had been recommended by Mr. Jarndyce and had expired, and he still continued to assure Ada and me in the same final manner that it was all right, it became advisable to take Mr. Kenge into counsel. Mr. Kenge therefore came down to dinner one day, and leaned back in his chair, and turned his eye-glasses over and over, and spoke in a sonorous voice, and did exactly what I remembered to have seen him do when I was a little girl.
"Ah!"
said Mr. Kenge.
"Yes. Well, a very good profession, Mr. Jarndyce, a very good profession. The course of study and preparation requires to be diligently pursued,"
observed my guardian with a glance at Richard.
"Oh, no doubt,"
said Mr. Kenge.
"Diligently. But that being the case, more or less, with all pursuits that are worth much,"
said Mr. Jarndyce,
"it is not a special consideration which another choice would be likely to escape." "Truly,"
said Mr. Kenge.
"And Mr. Richard Carstone, who has so meritoriously acquitted himself in the, shall I say, the classic shades, in which his youth had been passed, will no doubt apply the habits, if not the principles and practice, of versification in that tongue in which a poet was said, unless I mistake, to be born, not made, to the more eminently practical field of action on which he enters."
"You may rely upon it," said Richard in his off-hand manner,
"that I shall go at it and do my best." "Very well, Mr. Jarndyce,"
said Mr. Kenge, gently nodding his head.
"Really, when we are assured by Mr. Richard that he means to go at it and to do his best,"
nodding feelingly and smoothly over those expressions,
"I would submit to you that we have only to inquire into the best mode of carrying out the object of his ambition. Now, with reference to placing Mr. Richard with some sufficiently eminent practitioner, is there any one in view at present?"
"No one, Rick, I think,"
said my guardian.
"No one, sir,"
said Richard.
"Quite so,"
observed Mr. Kenge.
"As to situation, now, is there any particular feeling on that head?"
"No," said Richard.
"Quite so,"
observed Mr. Kenge again. "I should like a little variety," said Richard. "I mean, a good range of experience."
"Very requisite, no doubt,"
returned Mr. Kenge.
"I think this may be easily arranged, Mr. Jarndyce. We have only, in the first place, to discover a sufficiently eligible practitioner, and as soon as we make our want, and, shall I add, our ability to pay a premium, known, our only difficulty will be in the selection of one from a large number. We have only, in the second place, to observe those little formalities which are rendered necessary by our time of life and our being under the guardianship of the court. We shall soon be, shall I say, in Mr. Richard's own light-hearted manner, going at it, to our heart's content. It is a coincidence,"
said Mr. Kenge with a tinge of melancholy in his smile,
"one of those coincidences which may or may not require an explanation beyond our present limited faculties, that I have a cousin in the medical profession. He might be deemed eligible by you and might be disposed to respond to this proposal. I can answer for him as little as for you, but he might."
As this was an opening in the prospect, it was arranged that Mr. Kenge should see his cousin, and as Mr. Jarndyce had before proposed to take us to London for a few weeks, it was settled next day that we should make our visit at once and combine Richard's business with it. Mr. Boythorn leaving us within a week, we took up our abode at a cheerful lodging near Oxford Street, over an upholsterer's shop.
London was a great wonder to us, and we were out for hours and hours at a time seeing the sights, which appeared to be less capable of exhaustion than we were. We made the round of the principal theatres, too, with great delight, and saw all the plays that were worth seeing. I mention this because it was at the theatre that I began to be made uncomfortable again by Mr. Guppy. I was sitting in front of the box one night with Ada, and Richard was in the place he liked best, behind Ada's chair, when, happening to look down into the pit, I saw Mr. Guppy, with his hair flattened down upon his head and woe depicted in his face, looking up at me. I felt all through the performance that he never looked at the actors but constantly looked at me, and always with a carefully prepared expression of the deepest misery and the profoundest dejection. It quite spoiled my pleasure for that night, because it was so very embarrassing and so very ridiculous. But from that time forth we never went to the play without my seeing Mr. Guppy in the pit, always with his hair straight and flat, his shirt-collar turned down, and a general feebleness about him. If he were not there when we went in, and I began to hope he would not come, and yielded myself for a little while to the interest of the scene, I was certain to encounter his languishing eyes when I least expected it, and, from that time, to be quite sure that they were fixed upon me all the evening. I really cannot express how uneasy this made me. If he would only have brushed up his hair or turned up his collar, it would have been bad enough. But to know that absurd figure was always gazing at me, and always in that demonstrative state of despondency, put such a constraint upon me that I did not like to laugh at the play, or to cry at it, or to move, or to speak. I seemed able to do nothing naturally. As to escaping Mr. Guppy by going to the back of the box, I could not bear to do that, because I knew Richard and Ada relied on having me next them, and that they could never have talked together so happily if anybody else had been in my place. So there I sat, not knowing where to look, for wherever I looked I knew Mr. Guppy's eyes were following me, and thinking of the dreadful expense to which this young man was putting himself on my account. Sometimes I thought of telling Mr. Jarndyce. Then I feared that the young man would lose his situation, and that I might ruin him. Sometimes I thought of confiding in Richard, but was deterred by the possibility of his fighting Mr. Guppy and giving him black eyes. Sometimes I thought, should I frown at him or shake my head? Then I felt I could not do it. Sometimes I considered whether I should write to his mother, but that ended in my being convinced that to open a correspondence would be to make the matter worse. I always came to the conclusion finally that I could do nothing. Mr. Guppy's perseverance all this time not only produced him regularly at any theatre to which we went, but caused him to appear in the crowd as we were coming out, and even to get up behind our fly, where I am sure I saw him 2 or 3 times, struggling among the most dreadful spikes. After we got home, he haunted a post opposite our house. The upholsterer's where we lodged being at the corner of 2 streets, and my bedroom window being opposite the post, I was afraid to go near the window when I went upstairs, lest I should see him, as I did one moonlight night, leaning against the post and evidently catching cold. If Mr. Guppy had not been, fortunately for me, engaged in the daytime, I really should have had no rest from him. While we were making this round of gaieties, in which Mr. Guppy so extraordinarily participated, the business which had helped to bring us to town was not neglected. Mr. Kenge's cousin was a Mr. Bayham Badger, who had a good practice at Chelsea and attended a large public institution besides. He was quite willing to receive Richard into his house and to superintend his studies, and as it seemed that those could be pursued advantageously under Mr. Badger's roof, and Mr. Badger liked Richard, and as Richard said he liked Mr. Badger well enough, an agreement was made, the Lord Chancellor's consent was obtained, and it was all settled. On the day when matters were concluded between Richard and Mr. Badger, we were all under engagement to dine at Mr. Badger's house. We were to be merely a family party, Mrs. Badger's note said, and we found no lady there but Mrs. Badger herself. She was surrounded in the drawing-room by various objects indicative of her painting a little, playing the piano a little,
playing the guitar a little, playing the harp a little, singing a little, working a little, reading a little, writing poetry a little, and botanizing a little. She was a lady of about 50, I should think, youthfully dressed, and of a very fine complexion. If I add to the little list of her accomplishments that she rouged a little, I do not mean that there was any harm in it. Mr. Bayham Badger himself was a pink, fresh-faced, crisp-looking gentleman with a weak voice, white teeth, light hair, and surprised eyes, some years younger, I should say, than Mrs. Bayham Badger. He admired her exceedingly, but principally, and to begin with, on the curious ground, as it seemed to us, of her having had 3 husbands. We had barely taken our seats when he said to Mr. Jarndyce, quite triumphantly, "You would hardly suppose that I am Mrs. Bayham Badger's third?"
"Indeed?"
said Mr. Jarndyce. "Her third," said Mr. Badger. "Mrs. Bayham Badger has not the appearance, Miss Summerson, of a lady who has had 2 former husbands?" I said, "Not at all." "And most remarkable men," said Mr. Badger in a tone of confidence. "Captain Swosser, of the Royal Navy, who was Mrs. Badger's first husband, was a very distinguished officer indeed. The name of Professor Dingo, my immediate predecessor, is one of European reputation." Mrs. Badger overheard him and smiled. "Yes, my dear," Mr. Badger replied to the smile. "I was observing to Mr. Jarndyce and Miss Summerson that you had had 2 former husbands, both very distinguished men, and they found it, as people generally do, difficult to believe." "I was barely 20," said Mrs. Badger, "when I married Captain Swosser of the Royal Navy. I was in the Mediterranean with him. I am quite a sailor. On the 12th anniversary of my wedding day I became the wife of Professor Dingo."
"Of European reputation,"
added Mr. Badger in an undertone. "And when Mr. Badger and myself were married," pursued Mrs. Badger, "we were married on the same day of the year. I had become attached to the day." "So that Mrs. Badger has been married to 3 husbands, 2 of them highly distinguished men," said Mr. Badger, summing up the facts, "and each time upon the 21st of March at 11 in the forenoon." We all expressed our admiration.
"But for Mr. Badger's modesty," said Mr. Jarndyce, "I would take leave to correct him and say 3 distinguished men."
"Thank you, Mr. Jarndyce. What I always tell him," observed Mrs. Badger.
"And, my dear," said Mr. Badger, "what do I always tell you? That without any affectation of disparaging such professional distinction as I may have attained, which our friend Mr. Carstone will have many opportunities of estimating, I am not so weak, no really,"
said Mr. Badger to us generally,
"so unreasonable as to put my reputation on the same footing with such first-rate men as Captain Swosser and Professor Dingo. Perhaps you may be interested, Mr. Jarndyce,"
continued Mr. Bayham Badger, leading the way into the next drawing-room,
"in this portrait of Captain Swosser. It was taken on his return home from the African station, where he had suffered from the fever of the country. Mrs. Badger considers it too yellow, but it's a very fine head, a very fine head."
We all echoed, "A very fine head."
"I feel, when I look at it," said Mr. Badger, "that's a man I should like to have seen. It strikingly bespeaks the first-class man that Captain Swosser pre-eminently was. On the other side, Professor Dingo. I knew him well, attended him in his last illness, a speaking likeness. Over the piano, Mrs. Bayham Badger when Mrs. Swosser. Over the sofa, Mrs. Bayham Badger when Mrs. Dingo. Of Mrs. Bayham Badger in essay, I possess the original and have no copy."
Dinner was now announced, and we went downstairs. It was a very genteel entertainment, very handsomely served, but the captain and the professor still ran in Mr. Badger's head, and as Ada and I had the honour of being under his particular care, we had the full benefit of them. "Water, Miss Summerson. Allow me. Not in that tumbler, pray. Bring me the professor's goblet, James." Ada very much admired some artificial flowers under a glass. "Astonishing how they keep," said Mr. Badger. "They were presented to Mrs. Bayham Badger when she was in the Mediterranean." He invited Mr. Jarndyce to take a glass of claret. "Not that claret," he said. "Excuse me. This is an occasion, and on an occasion I produce some very special claret I happen to have. James, Captain Swosser's wine. Mr. Jarndyce, this is a wine that was imported by the captain. We will not say how many years ago. You'll find it very curious. My dear, I shall be happy to take some of this wine with you. Captain Swosser's claret to your mistress, James. My love, your health." After dinner, when we ladies retired, we took Mrs. Badger's first and second husband with us. Mrs. Badger gave us in the drawing-room a biographical sketch of the life and services of Captain Swosser before his marriage, and a more minute account of him dating from the time when he fell in love with her at a ball on board the Crippler, given to the officers of that ship when she lay in Plymouth Harbour. "The dear old Crippler," said Mrs. Badger, shaking her head. "She was a noble vessel, trim, ship-shape, all a taunto, as Captain Swosser used to say. You must excuse me if I occasionally introduce a nautical expression. I was quite a sailor once. Captain Swosser loved that craft for my sake. When she was no longer in commission, he frequently said that if he were rich enough to buy her old hulk, he would have an inscription let into the timbers of the quarter-deck where we stood as partners in the dance, to mark the spot where he fell, raked fore and aft. Captain Swosser used to say, 'By the fire from my tops.' It was his naval way of mentioning my eyes." Mrs. Badger shook her head, sighed, and looked in the glass. "It was a great change from Captain Swosser to Professor Dingo," she resumed with a plaintive smile. "I felt it a good deal at first, such an entire revolution in my mode of life. But custom, combined with science, particularly science, inured me to it. Being the professor's sole companion in his botanical excursions, I almost forgot that I had ever been afloat, and became quite learned. It is singular that the professor was the antipodes of Captain Swosser, and that Mr. Badger is not in the least like either." We then passed into a narrative of the deaths of Captain Swosser and Professor Dingo, both of whom seemed to have had very bad complaints. In the course of it, Mrs. Badger signified to us that she had never madly loved but once, and that the object of that wild affection, never to be recalled in its fresh enthusiasm, was Captain Swosser. The professor was yet dying by inches in the most dismal manner, and Mrs. Badger was giving us imitations of his way of saying with great difficulty, "Where is Laura? Let Laura give me my toast and water," when the entrance of the gentleman consigned him to the tomb. Now, I observed that evening, as I observed for some days past, that Ada and Richard were more than ever attached to each other's society, which was but natural, seeing that they were going to be separated so soon. I was therefore not very much surprised when we got home and Ada and I retired upstairs to find Ada more silent than usual, though I was not quite prepared for her coming into my arms and beginning to speak to me with her face hidden. "My darling Esther," murmured Ada, "I have a great secret to tell you." "A mighty secret, my pretty one, no doubt. What is it, Ada?" "Oh, Esther, you would never guess." "Shall I try to guess?" said I. "Oh, no, don't, pray don't!" cried Ada, very much startled by the idea of my doing so. "Now, I wonder who it can be about," said I, pretending to consider. "It's about," said Ada in a whisper, "it's about my cousin Richard." "Well, my own," said I, kissing her bright hair, which was all I could see, "and what about him?" "Oh, Esther, you would never guess!" It was so pretty to have her clinging to me in that way, hiding her face, and to know that she was not crying in sorrow, but in a little glow of joy and pride and hope that I would not help her just yet. "He says, I know it's very foolish, we are both so young, but he says," with a burst of tears, "that he loves me dearly, Esther." "Does he indeed?" said I. "I never heard of such a thing." "Why, my pet of pets, I could have told you that weeks and weeks ago." To see Ada lift up her flushed face in joyful surprise and hold me round the neck and laugh and cry and blush was so pleasant. "Why, my darling," said I, "what a goose you must take me for! Your cousin Richard has been loving you as plainly as he could for I don't know how long." "And yet you never said a word about it!" cried Ada, kissing me. "No, my love," said I. "I waited to be told." "But now I have told you, you don't think it wrong of me, do you?" returned Ada. She might have coaxed me to say no if I had been the hardest-hearted duenna in the world. Not being that, I said no very freely. "And now," said I know the worst of it." "Oh, that's not quite the worst of it, Esther dear!" cried Ada, holding me tighter and laying down her face again upon my breast. "No?" said I. "Not even that?" "No, not even that," said Ada, shaking her head. "Why, you never mean to say—" I was beginning in joke. But Ada, looking up and smiling through her tears, cried, "Yes, I do. You know I do!" And then sobbed out, "With all my heart I do! With all my heart, Esther!" I told her laughingly why I had known that too, just as well as I had known the other, and we sat before the fire, and I had all the talking to myself for a little while, though there was not much of it, and Ada was soon quiet and happy. "Do you think my cousin John knows, dear Dame Durden?" she asked. "Unless my cousin John is blind, my pet," said I should think my cousin John knows pretty well as much as we know." "We want to speak to him before Richard goes," said Ada timidly, "and we wanted you to advise us and to tell him so. Perhaps you wouldn't mind Richard's coming in, Dame Durden?" "Oh, Richard is outside, is he, my dear?" said I. "I am not quite certain," returned Ada, with a bashful simplicity that would have won my heart if she had not won it long before. "But I think he's waiting at the door." There he was, of course. They brought a chair on either side of me and put me between them, and really seemed to have fallen in love with me instead of one another, they were so confiding and so trustful and so fond of me. They went on in their own wild way for a little while. I never stopped them. I enjoyed it too much myself. And then we gradually fell to considering how young they were and how there must be a lapse of several years before this early love could come to anything, and how it could come to happiness only if it were real and lasting, and inspired them with a steady resolution to do their duty to each other with constancy, fortitude, and perseverance, each always for the other's sake. Well, Richard said that he would work his fingers to the bone for Ada, and Ada said that she would work her fingers to the bone for Richard, and they called me all sorts of endearing and sensible names, and we sat there advising and talking half the night. Finally, before we parted, I gave them my promise to speak to their cousin John to-morrow. So, when to-morrow came, I went to my guardian after breakfast in the room that was our town substitute for the growlery and told him that I had it in trust to tell him something.
"Well, little woman,"
said he, shutting up his book,
"if you have accepted the trust, there can be no harm in it."
"I hope not, guardian," said I. "I can guarantee that there is no secrecy in it, for it only happened yesterday."
"Aye? And what is it, Esther?"
"Guardian," said I, "you remember the happy night when first we came down to Bleak House, when Ada was singing in the dark room?" I wished to call to his remembrance the look he had given me then. Unless I am much mistaken, I saw that I did so. "Because," said I, with a little hesitation.
"Yes, my dear,"
said he.
"Don't hurry."
"Because," said I, "Ada and Richard have fallen in love and have told each other so."
"Already?"
cried my guardian, quite astonished. "Yes," said I, "and to tell you the truth, guardian, I rather expected it."
"The deuce you did!"
said he. He sat considering for a minute or two, with his smile, at once so handsome and so kind, upon his changing face, and then requested me to let them know that he wished to see them. When they came, he encircled Ada with one arm in his fatherly way and addressed himself to Richard with a cheerful gravity.
"Rick,"
said Mr. Jarndyce,
"I am glad to have won your confidence. I hope to preserve it. When I contemplated these relations between us four, which have so brightened my life and so invested it with new interests and pleasures, I certainly did contemplate, afar off, the possibility of you and your pretty cousin here (don't be shy, Ada, don't be shy, my dear) being in a mind to go through life together. I saw, and do see, many reasons to make it desirable. But that was afar off, Rick, afar off."
"We look afar off, sir," returned Richard.
"Well,"
said Mr. Jarndyce,
"that's rational. Now, hear me, my dears. I might tell you that you don't know your own minds yet, that 1,000 things may happen to divert you from one another, that it is as well this chain of flowers you have taken up is very easily broken, or it might become a chain of lead. But I will not do that. Such wisdom will come soon enough, I dare say, if it is to come at all. I will assume that a few years hence you will be in your hearts to one another what you are to-day. All I say before speaking to you according to that assumption is, if you do change, if you do come to find that you are more commonplace cousins to each other as man and woman than you were as boy and girl, your manhood will excuse me, Rick, don't be ashamed still to confide in me, for there will be nothing monstrous or uncommon in it. I am only your friend and distant kinsman. I have no power over you whatever, but I wish and hope to retain your confidence if I do nothing to forfeit it."
"I am very sure, sir,"
returned Richard,
"that I speak for Ada too when I say that you have the strongest power over us both, rooted in respect, gratitude, and affection, strengthening every day."
"Dear cousin John," said Ada on his shoulder, "my father's place can never be empty again. All the love and duty I could ever have rendered to him is transferred to you."
"Come,"
said Mr. Jarndyce,
"now for our assumption. Now we lift our eyes up and look hopefully at the distance. Rick, the world is before you, and it is most probable that as you enter it, so it will receive you. Trust in nothing but in Providence and your own efforts. Never separate the two like the heathen waggoner. Constancy in love is a good thing, but it means nothing and is nothing without constancy in every kind of effort. If you had the abilities of all the great men, past and present, you could do nothing well without sincerely meaning it and setting about it. if you entertain the supposition that any real success, in great things or in small, ever was or could be, ever will or can be, wrested from fortune by fits and starts, leave that wrong idea here, or leave your cousin Ada here." "I will leave it here, sir," replied Richard, smiling. "If I brought it here just now, but I hope I did not, and will work my way on to my cousin Ada in the hopeful distance." "Right," said Mr. Jarndyce. "If you are not to make her happy, why should you pursue her?" "I wouldn't make her unhappy. No, not even for her love," retorted Richard proudly. "Well said!" cried Mr. Jarndyce. "That's well said. She remains here in her home with me. Love her, Rick, in your active life no less than in her home when you revisit it, and all will go well. Otherwise, all will go ill. That's the end of my preaching. I think you and Ada had better take a walk." Ada tenderly embraced him, and Richard heartily shook hands with him, and then the cousins went out of the room, looking back again directly, though, to say that they would wait for me. The door stood open, and we both followed them with our eyes as they passed down the adjoining room, on which the sun was shining, and out at its farther end. Richard, with his head bent and her hand drawn through his arm, was talking to her very earnestly, and she looked up in his face, listening, and seemed to see nothing else. So young, so beautiful, so full of hope and promise, they went on lightly through the sunlight, as their own happy thoughts might then be traversing the years to come and making them all years of brightness. So they passed away into the shadow and were gone. It was only a burst of light that had been so radiant. The room darkened as they went out, and the sun was clouded over. "Am I right, Esther?" said my guardian when they were gone. He was so good and wise to ask me whether he was right. "Rick may gain out of this the quality he wants at the core of so much that is good," said Mr. Jarndyce, shaking his head. "I have said nothing to Ada, Esther. She has her friend and counsellor always near." And he laid his hand lovingly upon my head. I could not help showing that I was a little moved, though I did all I could to conceal it. "Tut, tut!" said he. "But we must take care, too, that our little woman's life is not all consumed in care for others."
"Care? My dear guardian, I believe I am the happiest creature in the world."
"I believe so, too," said he. "But some one may find out what Esther never will, that the little woman is to be held in remembrance above all other people."
I have omitted to mention in its place that there was some one else at the family dinner-party. It was not a lady, it was a gentleman. It was a gentleman of a dark complexion, a young surgeon. He was rather reserved, but I thought him very sensible and agreeable. At least, Ada asked me if I did not, and I said yes.
End of chapter 13.